Hello there, this is Derek Taylor, and this is our second lecture for HIST 129, Early Modern Europe. So this lecture is going to be on the Reformation. First a couple of lectures on the Reformation. This one on Erasmus and Luther. You see from the image in the background there, it's Luther on the right, Desiderius Erasmus on the left, and Humanism and Reformation in the 16th century. And in this lecture, it's kind of meant to go along with the second chapter in your textbook, just talking more deeply about what humanism was, how it played into the Protestant Reformation, how the Reformation happened, and how it comes out of reform efforts that are already underway in the later part of the medieval period in early modern Europe, and just talk about how it came out of. And this is the thing to remember why I'm pitting Erasmus and Luther together and partly against each other, but putting them together because the Reformation happens between, it becomes, Middle Church breaks up, becomes Protestant versus Catholic. But even then, as you're going to see, it's between reformers who wind up on different sides of the theological divide. In fact, as it's going to see, and I'll get to this in the next lecture, reformers went out in the Catholic Church eventually as well, and we'll see how this happens. But I want to talk about that in longer perspective here, and what the role of the educational reform movement we call humanism played in all this. So let's get started. Let's talk about the new learning. This is what humanism gets to be called in England in the later part of the Middle Ages. And Erasmus is one of the great figures of the northern humanists, 15th and 16th centuries. So humanism, you probably know something about this from your high school days, but one thing to note about humanism is that it's, for all that it does counterpose itself, humanists are, we'll get to this in a minute, opposed to scholasticism. They come out of the Middle Ages. It's a medieval movement. Humanism begins more or less as we understand it in 14th century Italy. It basically is a bookish movement. Medieval culture years ago, C.S. Lewis in his book, The Discarded Image, talked about medieval culture being bookish, clarkish, whatever you want to say. The medieval world thought wisdom came out of books. And so it's part and parcel of this, and it's not really, in that sense, a change at all. Medieval, we'll talk about scholasticism here. If you talk about medieval universities, if you know anything about scholasticism, this is the system of education that they had in medieval universities, in which a body of text was passed on from generation to generation in the universities, and each person who went through this system of education would go through the 7 liberal arts. I can remember what these are. The quadrivium, which is, the trivium is grammar, rhetoric, logic. Those are the 3 linguistic arts. And there's the 3 mathematical arts: geometry, astronomy, music, and arithmetic. I can't remember the other one, but you get the idea, those basic things. And you'd go, if you're going to be a theologian, you would take these bodies of ancient texts, church councils, decrees of popes, stuff like this, scripture as well, and write commentaries upon them. And you would have arguments, discussions on them based on logic, on dialectical reasoning, arguing back and forth in a sometimes called a sort of compared to medieval trial by combat, where you have a text set up, the professor opens up a question, has 2 students argue on back and forth each side of the question. At the end of this disputation, the professor will point out the flaws in each of the arguments of the students, trying to bring them together. So it's this very logic-oriented type of system, which this is what humanists are reacting against. They're going to want to basically, 2 things. One, they're going to want to approach books in a different way, ancient books, but they're still approaching ancient books. And slightly, as you'll see, a different set of ancient books as well. So it's part of this, again, this, early modern, we call it early modern. It's still coming out of a medieval setting. And finally, a print revolution. Again, this is something that gets into academic discussions about the early modern period. Years ago, people used to talk about a printing revolution in early modern Europe because, of course, the idea is you can print more books, you can have more learning, people learn more, all this stuff. There's no question the long run does that. Maybe not immediately, and in fact, for humanism, it doesn't really mean much. Again, the humanists, arrive in Italy with the Renaissance a century before. Printing makes its way into Europe in 1450s, so probably not as much there. Although the printing press is, it's utilized by, royal courts, the papal court, the papacy makes use of the printing press. So it's not necessarily something seen to be, opposed to tradition. This is what's going to be the criticism in some ways, weirdly, of humanism, even though it's still in a way a kind of backward looking type of learning system, because it's still focused on ancient books. And what it is, of course, is an alternative sort of study, course of study, the Studia Humanitatis. Instead of, there are three major faculties in most universities in the Middle Ages. You can study law, theology, or medicine. They're going to focus on something entirely different. The various academies in humanist academies in early modern Europe, and again, they're going to be outside the university system. Why? Because the universities don't want to share their resources and their institution with them, the people they disagree with, as usual. And the Studia Humanitatis just means a course in things like, besides, studying, I mentioned the seven liberal arts, besides, study all those things, you'll definitely study rhetoric. That's a big thing. We'll get to this in a moment. But also things like moral philosophy, history, poetry. And the reason why is that these humanists admire classical texts. And as your textbook mentions this, we're talking about classical antiquity, pagan antiquity, which the medievals knew about, but they didn't value quite in the same way. Classical antiquity was a sort of handmaiden to theology in the Middle Ages and the scholastic notion of thought. Here, they thought of this in very different terms, partly because they approached these texts in a different way. What they wanted, their concern was classical rhetoric, the idea of being able to persuade people of something, not prove it's true, which again, this is where the criticism, and a lot of it's propaganda, that the late scholastics, a lot of their work could be kind of dense and difficult and hard to understand. And so this is where you get the, the idea that they're all a bunch of dunces. This is where you get that word dunce, by the way, comes from a name of a late medieval theologian named Johannes Duns Scotus, someone who who's obsessed with quibbles and with meaningless questions and logic chopping types of exercises. These humanists, like Erasmus, favored rhetoric over this logic. They thought it was simpler, more elegant. They favored a simpler style of learning, a simpler style of writing. Late medieval texts can be very, very, again, very hard to understand. By the way, late medieval theologians, late medieval philosophers did great work, actually. We know that some late medieval philosophers did work in, for example, mathematical logic, stuff that was so sophisticated. Once it was abandoned under the influence of humanism later in the 16th century, their work wouldn't be picked up again to the 20th century by modern philosophers, people like Bertrand Russell. That's how sophisticated it was. But this turn against that just abstruse logic led philosophy and then away from that sort of thing. The other thing they put a lot of emphasis on is learning languages. This is a really important difference to what goes on in medieval universities, because what they're concerned with there is just learning Latin well enough to discuss the text under study, which are almost all going to be, they're going to be, basically you're critiquing the tradition, not critiquing, but you're studying the tradition in the medieval universities, and you're more concerned about, again, using philosophical logic, dialectical reasoning to, come to a conclusion about the meaning of the text, rather than what you have here for these humanists is going to be critical is the understanding of language and the history of languages, how words change over time. This is going to be one of their main contributions to Western civilization, in fact. By critical, I put that in quotation marks because it's not really all that critical. A lot of the humanists take things to be ancient that aren't, and have they have really skewed notions of history to a certain degree, but they do compare texts from different dates, and they do discover things. This is where you get some of the battles between them and the scholastics. One of the most famous of these instances of these, of course, is the discovery of Lorenzo Valla. You know, Lorenzo Valla was a humanist, was a papal secretary, was a secretary to one of the popes, and he discovered that a document called the Donation of Constantine was a forgery. What's the Donation of Constantine? Constantine, of course, was the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. And so the story went, according to the papacy, that medieval popes had said this since the 9th century, that, well, look, we had this document saying that Constantine gave political authority to the Pope, and they used this to bolster their claims, political authority in the Middle Ages. Well, Lorenzo went and compared that text to text from the 4th century, from the time when Constantine was alive. He noticed the Latin was very different. And he went and compared it and found it actually matched up to Latin from the late 9th century. And they think it was written by a priest, probably in Rome in the late 9th century. And again, this is one of the things they did do that was, this was a real advance. Also, of course, was embarrassing to a certain degree to a degree. I say to a degree because he was employed by a pope. A lot. Again, it's one of the things we should think about here when I say humanism. You probably know this from it's probably trickled down to the high school level. Humanism does not equal secular humanism at all. A lot of this stuff is, within the confines of the church, well after this period. So we're not talking about necessarily anti-religious, but for that particular claim, it was like, okay, that's obviously not true, huh? People had suspicions about it before then, but he proved it because of this. And so you have that aspect of humanism, that obsession with rhetoric. You also have, and this is fortuitous because of what happens in the 15th century, an influx of new texts, but also new languages. Because the other thing that makes them different from the scholastics are like, Latin is our tradition. We need to be, reverential toward tradition. Because of things like the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, a bunch of Greek-speaking scholars fled to Italy. And so for the first time since late antiquity, you had people learning Greek in the West. They had lost that language. Now they can study things like Aristotle, Plato, ancient Greek philosophers in the original languages. The New Testament, Witness in the Second. This is one of the things Erasmus is famous for. And so they can compare those texts. And so this leads to disputes about what the text means. But even just in that sense, you also have an influx of new texts from Byzantium or from the East, which has simply been lost. Certain texts of Plato that hadn't been discovered, certain texts of Aristotle they hadn't had, certain texts of the church fathers they hadn't had access to. So you have all of this, this stuff coming in. Ideas, for example, things that have been more or less banished because of Christian strictures against what they thought was atheism. Things like atomism, if you know what this is. This is the idea, the Epicurean idea, another philosophy that the early Christian church didn't have much to do with, which said that the entire universe was formed by the banging together of atoms, which will become, by the way, very important later on in the history of this rise in the natural sciences. It'll spur a lot of what we think of as the early modern science in the 17th century. All these things feed into humanism in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, as we understand it. So I've kind of described it here. I'm making it sound like it's a medieval thing, and okay, what's new about it? I just described one thing that's new about it, the text that came in. But is there anything new about their method? Well, the method to a certain degree is, but a few things are new or they're not new. One thing that's new about these humanists is they have this idea of civic humanism, which I'm going to leave to the side here for the most part because it has to do with politics, there's thinking of Machiavelli, stuff like this, but the idea of republicanism comes back into vogue. The idea that, a truly, whatever Republican people are, they're not subjects to a prince or something like this, but they are citizens. They take an active role in society. They're not very passive. You're coming to the end of the Middle Ages. There's beginning to be, there is by this time, a little bit of laymen are becoming literate again in large enough numbers to take over the reign. In the Middle Ages, it was all priests doing that because they're the only ones who can read and write. And so this is a body of thought designed to appeal to a lot of people for that reason. So it comes into this through those texts, of Cicero and things like that. Another thing that's new about the new learning is historical perspective. And I'm thinking of Machiavelli here, but other Renaissance thinkers, Italian thinkers, a lot of them. But it comes with this comparison of texts, this idea that you're looking at the past as different from the present. In the Middle Ages, again, they didn't really think in those terms. They thought of it as being this immemorial tradition, that the gospel is telling them something about their world as it is right now. That's why when you look at, images of, for example, of the nativity, the birth of Christ in the Bible, he's wearing medieval clothes in the Middle Ages because they don't think of it as being distant from them, psychologically speaking. What happens in the 14th century when you have people like Petrarch, can't remember his actual name, Petrarch, anyway, the humanist and poet, they begin to see the past as something distant from them because they begin to think of their own day as being the Dark Ages. It's Petrarch who actually coins that phrase to describe Renaissance Italy. And kind of fun. But they begin to see it as something distant, something better, something they've fallen away from. And so this is the beginnings of, they don't quite have what we have. They tend to think of it. Part of this gets sort of negated by the fact that so many thinkers are inspired by classical texts, like Polybius, the Greek-speaking historian, who sees the world moving cyclically in cyclical terms, so that history just repeats itself over and over again. So it's not like us, where we think of, history as being, you can have the same society be radically different over time, but they do see it as being different in an important way, which is important for the future and new. And then finally, you can kind of overdo this, but the idea of individual glory as the great 19th century historian, Jakob Burckhardt, talked about the Renaissance, this pursuit of individual, glory. Erasmus is a good example of this. This is someone who, he kind of gloried in his fame. He was the most famous guy in Europe, was Erasmus, known throughout the entirety of Europe, had patrons all over Europe. The idea, this comes from classical antiquity, right? Just think about the ancient Olympic Games, right? The Greek Olympic Games. You know how we have team sports in the modern Olympics? There were no team sports in the ancient Olympics. It was all mano a mano because they had this individualism built into Greek culture. And that's kind of what comes through some of these texts. And so you get this sort of, passion for glory and for being someone who can do all things. This is the whole idea of, the Renaissance man, right? Baldassare Castiglione, 1528. This book about this, the courtier, book of the courtier, who can do everything, right? Poetry, ride horses, he's a good athlete, he can dance, he can do all this stuff. Pursuing individuality. Again, this is overdone. You shouldn't think of this in modern terms. It's a resuscitation of ancient ideas. It's a weird, in some ways, how backward looking humanism actually was. And in some ways, retarded learning. I mean, again, even its obsession with language sounds good until you realize they tried to replace the living language of Latin in the West. It was a living language in universities and the church, with slavishly copying these ancient, 1,000-year-old dead version of the language. So it's kind of interesting the way it worked out. Even though, as with the Reformation, it's a desire to go back that kind of leads to a break with the past. Which brings us to reform before the Reformation. Because one of the things I want to emphasize here is that the Reformation doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a long, centuries-long effort, by the way, to reform the Christian world in Western Europe. And in fact, this is, generally speaking, you tend to see the late Middle Ages tends to be talked about, at least in popular parlance, as nothing but this horrible, awful time. That's why the Reformation obviously happened. It was obvious. In some ways, that's true. By the way, there were serious problems at the end of the Middle Ages. There was a decay of religious life. I don't mean religious life in terms of people being pious and devout. I mean a decay of monastic life. Life lived by a rule, if you don't know what this is in Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox churches. People who live according to a rule live in a monastery, or they're, in terms of the Western movement, they're friars who live under the rule of St. Francis, for example. These are people who live according to rule, but they beg for their living. They're mendicants. They go out and live that way. And there's clearly a decline in the quality of religious houses in Western Europe. This happened several times throughout the history of Western Christianity, at least Catholic world. You'll get a decay, and then monasteries be refounded, but they fall away from their original fervor, the mission of these monasteries. They'll become dumping grounds for aristocrats who have daughters or sons they don't know what to do with. They'll dump them in there. People who don't really have genuine religious vocations will go in there. They'll become overly wealthy, and they'll become wealthy. And this is the cycle. This is kind of the weird thing. At first, they will be these, austere houses of prayer that people want to donate money to, so they can pray for them. We'll come back to this in a moment to get the Reformation. This idea of praying for the dead, obviously, is something that the Reformation attacked. But people will donate land and money because they are devout. Well, of course, over time, that saps makes them more and more worldly. And so you're coming into one of these periods at the end of the Middle Ages. Another major problem in the Middle Ages is just simply people not doing their jobs. Bishops have a tendency to gather sees. What they do is they get the papacy to sign off on them having multiple sees in their own jurisdiction, multiple bishoprics. Why? You pay somebody else to go do the work of preaching to the flock and taking care of them. And these they're called benefices. They're bishoprics or livings that have land attached to them. So they have rents, they make money. They do this to make money. And so this is a scandalous thing at the end of the Middle Ages, as well as simony is the buying and selling of church offices, which is something people have been complaining about for several centuries before this. There are also, of course, challenges to the church in the later part of the Middle Ages. People like the Lollards in England in the 14th century. These are people that took their cue from John Wycliffe, who was a Oxford theologian, who challenged certain medieval church's teachings on things like the doctrine of the Eucharist, transubstantiation, denied this, taught things that seemed like a little bit proto-Protestant to a certain degree. He certainly claimed that by later Protestant thinkers. He escapes condemnation, but his followers don't. In the 15th century, they get sort of pretty hounded and persecuted by the church and the government. Actually, it's state actually does this in England, not the church. And they're sort of put down that way. But they also, of course, produce an English Bible, which, again, they're clamped down on that. There were English Bibles before the Reformation. There were vernacular Bibles before the Reformation. What bothered them here was they were actually insinuating, Wycliffe's ideas into some of their devotional works and their biblical translations. And he sent out these, poor, he called them his poor workers or something like this, did Wycliffe, laymen to go out and preach in the countryside, the Saulston of people in 15th century England. And of course, you have the Hussites, followers of Jan Hus, the Czech theologian. Again, a lot there's a theme here of academics. You'll get to Luther, was also an academic university professor challenging the church. His was mostly a challenge of papal authority. He was for his trial. Also, there's a whole schism, actually, the church in Bohemia, where he's from, last for more than a century. But he's put to death by the Council of Constance, which we'll get to in a moment. But you have those challenges there. So you have challenges to its authority from within. You also have, of course, in a more broad sense of the Christian world, being challenged by the advance of the Ottoman armies into Europe, which they definitely see as a religious challenge. I put it in that sense there. There's lots of things coming from in and outside. You have real problems with the papacy in the latter part of the Middle Ages. If you don't know, in the early part of the 14th century, the 1309, the papacy left Rome for about 70 years for a variety of reasons. Rome wasn't a really pleasant place in the Middle Ages, kind of a mud hole. Plus, there were aristocratic families that fought like cats and dogs to try to control the papacy. So they left to go to France, Avignon for 70 years. When papists came back, the French cardinals had gotten used to having a French pope. The Italians, of course, one was Italian pope, so in 1378, one was elected. Within a few weeks, the French cardinals realized this person was not going to be amenable to them, so they basically claimed that he had not been rightfully elected, that only elected him under pressure. They elected their own anti-pope. So you have this schism, the Great Western Schism, opening up for about 40 years or close to it, from 1378 to 1417. Really does a number on the papacy's standing among people of the peoples, well, no, the governments of Europe. The great Medici ruler, Lorenzo the Magnificent, would later say this is the 15th century, because at one point there were, of course, two popes. At one point there were three popes in this schism. At one point, Lorenzo the Magnificent once said that he wished there had been four popes. In other words, they liked the fact that papacy was being weakened because it didn't mean they couldn't interfere with their governments as much as they did in the High Middle Ages. One fallout from this, they eventually did call a council, got all these popes to sort of stand down, or they just deposed them. Called the Council of Constance in 1415, ends in 1417. This leads to another challenge to the papacy, what's called conciliarism. This is the idea that the papacy is not the supreme authority in the Catholic Church, but church councils. So the idea actually comes out of the Council of Constance. For 2 or 3 decades, about 3 decades after the Council of Constance, there are efforts to put this into practice. After 1450, it basically dies out, but it lingers on for a long, long time. Definitely into the 16th century. It's definitely in the backs of people's minds in 1517, when the whole thing starts with Martin Luther, especially in Germany, because Constance, the council was held in Germany, in Constance. And in fact, there are other councils held to try to reform the church before then. There's a council of 1512, the Fifth Lateran Council. A lot of the ideas that we put into practice at the Council of Trent in the 1560s are discussed and promulgated in 1512. This council of the Fifth Lateran Council, which according to the Roman Catholic Church is an ecumenical council, went nowhere. Everybody ignored it, mainly because it was controlled completely by Julius II, who was the Pope at the time. They didn't think it was a legitimate council, really, is what happened. So it just went nowhere. So big failures there. And of course, I mentioned this last time in my first lecture. This is the age, in the late 15th century, early 16th century, of warfare across the Italian world, in which the Pope, as you know, again under Julius II, who is involved in this. Erasmus actually writes a satire after his death on all the warfare that Julius II got involved in. That again, of course, you know, for some people who are pious, that's a real awful thing that he's involved in warfare. One of the worst things, of course, is the corruption of the Curia. It's really corrupt. At the end of the Middle Ages, this is the age, of course, late 15th century, the age of the Borgia popes, which you probably know this from popular culture, and there's, you know, he has mistresses and stuff like this. That was actually not the worst thing for most of these people at the time. One of the worst thing, and this was something that all popes did, was the nepotism of the Borgias. The raising up of their relatives to be cardinals and stuff like this, and giving them, again, money of the church that should be going toward, you know, spreading the gospel, is going toward building up these families. This was actually the thing that, when I say corruption of the Curia, this is one of the real bad things that they just didn't have the institutional fortitude to actually deal with before the Reformation. So all these things are problems in the late Middle Ages. Having said all that, there's actually a lot of reform going on in the early 16th century by the time you get to the Reformation. There are, for example, the founding of new religious orders, new ones, literally new ones, but the founding of observant orders. We mentioned this before. You have the founding of observant or strict, you know, Benedictine monasteries, strict Dominican friaries that strictly hold the original rule of St. Dominic, one of these mendicant teaching orders like the Franciscans. And so you have this as an aspect of late medieval and early modern life. New orders like the Theatines will become, again, popular in the 16th century, are founded in early 1500s, are part of this process. You'll also have a massive growth of lay piety in the Middle Ages. In the 14th century, and this is important for Erasmus, in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands, a group called the Brethren of the Common Life is formed, which is one of these sort of confraternities. Confraternities are associations of laymen who meet together for, you know, spiritual fellowship and stuff like this, studying the Gospels and stuff like that. And it becomes widespread throughout Europe. It stresses a sort of, you know, simpler lay version of piety, if you know what I mean by this. usually one that's sort of more, again, simplified for lay people who live in the world. But these confraternities become widely popular in the Middle Ages. And we know there's growing piety, growing literacy, because besides all this, we have lots of evidence in books of hours. You know what these are? These are books printed, and they're popular, sold really well. Books of hours are books of the church's cycle of prayer in the Middle Ages, which are made for laymen. I don't have any pictures in my slides, but you've seen the Duc de Berry, the Hours of the Duc de Berry. French one has these beautiful painted, illuminated books of hours where you had the prayers and these wonderful illustrations. And so there's a lot of lay piety in that regard in terms of people being involved in the religious life. There's also something else that happens in the Middle Ages. This can be taken in two ways, but there's also a sort of I don't say spasm, but there's a sort of effusion of mystical text written by lay people in the Middle Ages, 14th and 15th centuries. People like Marjorie Kemp in England, Richard Rolle, other lay people across Europe writing down mystical experiences they've had. One historian of the Reformation, a reformed historian of the Reformed Protestant tradition, Heiko Obermann, called this phenomenon the democratization of mysticism. And I say this because you can take that as, he thought, as pointing toward a lay spirituality that feeds into Protestantism. But you could see that as feeding into a lay sort of Catholicism too later on. But you could also see it in a negative light, right? The negative light would be, well, if lay people are looking for mysticism, that must mean there's something wrong with something they're not getting from the institutional church. But Obermann actually, he actually put this in these terms. What's happening is they're internalizing what they're reading, what they're learning from the church, actually. So probably a little bit of truth to both of those things, but I think you can see that in a positive light, mostly a growth of, lay spirituality. Third one I'll get to in a moment, because that's what we're going to talk about with Erasmus, which is, I put religious humanism. You should call it Christian humanism. It's the use of humanistic learning to further the Christian message and the Christian gospel. And then finally, there are some, not enough, there are some reforming bishops throughout Western Europe who are taking the time to, there's one his name's Stang in France, I can't remember which diocese off the top of my head, but who found new monastic foundations, which are more strict and more observant. You have people building building things in their diocese and taking good care of things. You have some bishops, for example, who are patrons of humanism. In England, John Fisher, who's the Bishop of Rochester, is a humanist and someone who actually a patron of humanist scholars in England, and who was someone who was well known for his and this is rare, for literally going and visiting all the churches in his diocese while he was bishop there. Also rare because he refused. I believe they tried to make him Archbishop of Canterbury. He refused. Stayed in his diocese. Again, this is common because most bishops want to go up the ladder of the church as high as they can. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the church in England. He didn't do that. As well as someone like Cardinal Cisneros, I believe is his name. Can't remember his first name. Jimenez Cisneros in Spain, who founds a university there, is a patron of humanism. He's one of these reforming bishops. So you do have, reforms going on. The problem is that you don't have reform hitting. First of all, it doesn't affect everything all at once. Second thing is it doesn't affect the most visible aspects of the church, which are the hierarchy and especially the curia, the papal curia, where the corruption's most visible. But you do have reform, and I should mention just one last in passing. Again, this is preceded by centuries of talk about reform and efforts of reform as well. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. The Reformation. And just to give you another picture of the Council of Constance in 1415. It's hard to describe what high hopes they had for that council in 1415. They issued all these reforms about holding councils, about trying to have bishops take greater care of their diocese. All came to nothing, which is unfortunately one of the things you have involved in all this. And this, I forgot to mention this. This is on the left-hand side, I believe you have the earliest printed edition of the Imitation of Christ. And the Imitation of Christ was a famous manual of spirituality written by Thomas à Kempis in the 15th century. And you see on the left-hand side, published in Latin in the 15th century. Thomas à Kempis was a member of the Brethren of the Common Life. And that he was a monk, though. So it's written for monks, this little booklet becomes widely popular in the 15th century. It will remain widely popular even in Protestant countries after the Reformation. And the reason why is, and this will feed into Erasmus, what we're talking about here, is humanism and feeds into a sort of lay piety that wants a simpler, more interiorly focused, less emphasis on external actions and works and stuff like that. And in fact, there are some things in the original Imitation of Christ that deal with monks. They take them out in some of the Protestant versions. You see from this publication in 1580, it was wildly popular because it sounded like close enough to Protestantism in the later period. Which brings us, of course, to Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus of Rotterdam, as he called himself. He's born in Rotterdam. He's educated by the Brethren of the Common Life in the Netherlands, in Deventer. And eventually, after his parents die, he has to enter a monastery, enters an Augustinian monastery, which he detests. He comes to really hate monasticism. His experience is not good. He didn't like, again, the discipline was very strict there. Erasmus was a very sensitive, not to say anal retentive person. He's the, sort of caricature of a fussy academic type. And whatever the reasons, I've heard all sorts of things suggested, had a really bad experience there. He's allowed to accompany a bishop as a secretary, gets a dispensation to leave the monastery. He never goes back as a young man. And he begins to travel throughout Europe, going to different universities, royal courts, and becoming a sort of traveling scholar throughout Europe. And this will be his claim to fame. He'll do several things we'll get to in a moment, but becomes an apostle for education through humanist study. And it's very important to understand this is one of the first things he writes is a book called Adages, which is a bunch of quotations from classical works. And again, this is humanist learning. It's having these little handy quotations you can, whip out at parties or something. But learning those good adages that lead to a moral life. This will be one of the big things that humanists are about is, education leads to making a better moral person. And Erasmus certainly believes in this. Now, when I talk about him in religious terms, one of the things I need to mention about Erasmus, I've talked about the bookishness of medieval culture. I've talked about bookishness of the humanists. Well, I brought this picture to show you. This is actually made the background for my slide of my first lecture. This is a picture from 1559 by the Flemish painter Peter Bruegel. The fight between Carnival and Lent. And you can kind of see what this is here is it's an allegory to a certain degree of, the desire for food and all that stuff. And Lent is the time of penance and fasting. I put this up here because it's a perfect illustration of what in some ways both Erasmus, but also Luther, but definitely Erasmus is reacting against. Erasmus's idea of Christian faith, as I'll get to in a second, is very idealized. It's based on old books, Bible, church fathers, classical authors. Yeah, he puts those together. And it's kind of airbrushed from real life. He's someone who has a really intense sense of disgust. He doesn't like the body all that much. And of course, medieval religion as practiced by most people was not a matter of books. It was a matter of rituals. It was a matter of pilgrimages, processions. It was a matter of, sometimes really weird, sometimes gross rituals. I won't go through some of the stuff, but it's some weird stuff. The most, of course, raucous of these being Carnival, right? This is the period just before Lent, before it begins to, go hog wild. This is where you have Carnival, the source of the modern Carnival in places like New Orleans and Brazil and other places. And if you've ever read your Chaucer, you know that things like pilgrimage, this type of spirituality, this type of religious life can be an occasion for what looks like pure worldliness to the devout, like to the very sensitive devout, like Erasmus. And so there is very much in Erasmus and his version of Christianity a very, well, it's elitist. It's elitist. It doesn't, it's very much something in his mind as much as anything else. And he's reacting against this. This is the kind of thing he's reacting against. Doesn't like this at all. And he calls this his philosophy of Christ. And again, one of the attitudes he brings with him from his humanist study is a desire to go back to the sources. That's the Latin phrase, ad fontes, to the sources, to the sources, to the sources. Again, in the Middle Ages, they're content to read commentaries, right? We're part of a tradition. We're having this chain of stuff. And this is one of the things that really comes when they come to blows over this, the scholastics, when people criticize Erasmus at the University of Paris, for example, a lot of critics, he gets condemned several times by them. What they're criticizing is they think he's undermining, the heritage by criticizing things that they've been received as if it was somehow false now or something. Whereas what Erasmus wants to do is go back over, this stuff to the original text. His criticism, for example, he publishes in 1516 his Greek edition of the New Testament. He criticizes Saint Jerome. Saint Jerome is the 5th century church father who translated the Bible from its original languages of Hebrew and Greek into Latin. And so this is the standard edition that the Catholic Church, I think still the official edition, the Vulgate. And again, people are like, how can you criticize St. Jerome's a saint? He's one of the 4 great doctors of the Western Church. How can you criticize, this great figure? And he's doing it based on, well, I went back to original sources and I think he's wrong. And by the way, not everything Erasmus said was actually correct. He got a lot of things wrong, actually. And in fact, there were other humanists who disagreed with him, who thought that St. Jerome's translation was better than his. It was not. Sometimes because of Erasmus's fame, you get this sense that there was no, all the sort of scholastics were just, hidebound, moronic. That's a lot of humanist propaganda. And in fact, later on, I think your book kind of plays into this a little bit, which is kind of odd. I think your textbook actually says, the author says at one point, that they threw over Thomas Aquinas and that was the end of things. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, in the medieval universities, they did eventually accept the idea you had to have knowledge of these languages. They found chairs of Hebrew and Greek and stuff like that in the universities. But it was kind of a mixture. They never got rid of this dialectical reasoning or scholastic theology. In fact, there was a revival of scholasticism and theology in the Catholic Church in Spain in the 1550s, but also at the end of the 16th century in the Protestant world, in Lutheran and Reformed circles. They actually went back to Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus and some other later medieval thinkers and began doing their own scholastic version of Protestantism. And the reason being is, like, you still need to think logically. You can't. They understood that, a lot of them. We tend to present that to you sometimes in textbooks as, it's not quite. It was a big thing at the time because these university types didn't want anybody honing in on their turf. They didn't want to give chairs of theology to people who, well, they don't know the dialectic, they don't know the logic. These interlopers with their Greek grammar and stuff like this. And we can overrate in some ways, I think, the skills of the humanists, although they're the first ones to do something like critical study of ancient text and the Bible and things like that. But he wants to go back behind what's the received tradition, and this is what causes some conflict. His philosophy also is very moralistic. Erasmus wants a simplified faith, which doesn't deal on extraneous external things, but has, focus on the moral teachings of Christ, and doesn't focus on abstruse notions of dogma like the Trinity or papal infallibility or stuff like this, or like with Luther, justification. We'll get to that, but simplified stuff. And to give you an idea, when I say simplified, the medieval theologians, writers, artists, they had a gift for elaboration, for making systems, for elaborating things in highly intense detail. I'll give you an example from Erasmus. He gave told a story one time to Erasmus that when he was in Paris for Lent, and he went to hear this preacher who had a good reputation there in Paris, and the preacher, when he went the first day of Lent, gave a sermon on the prodigal son. You know the story of the prodigal son. This is the story where the son asks this father to give him his inheritance, and he goes away and squanders it all, and then comes back after he squandered it all, and the father welcomes him. It's a nice story. Anyway, that's the story of the prodigal son. And he preached on the story of the prodigal son. It's only like a few verses in the New Testament. He preached on this same story for all 40 days of Lent, did this preacher. How did he do that? He kept embellishing it, making up a biography for the prodigal son, and telling him what it was like to eat the pig food, and what his life was like, and going through every detail and making stuff up. And this is the kind of thing that Erasmus hated. And you can see how excessive some of this stuff could be. Medieval thinkers didn't care, right? They liked the sort of fill in the details that you didn't get in scripture this way. And half the time, that's what people would actually know, is the details that people filled in for them and not the actual original. That's what they wanted to do. That's part of the reason that we're going on here about this stuff. But also the idea of interior piety over external devotion. Erasmus was really critical of, again, pilgrimages. The idea, this is very much, he doesn't come at this again from a theological point of view in the way Luther will, but very much despises, I'll say it, he's an elitist. He just doesn't like common people. He doesn't like their rituals and stuff like this. It's nasty. It's thoughtless. It's just about, doing dead, it's external. It's not, Gus, get that, Gus. So I have my dog barking here. Anyway, the dog that did bark. But this is one of the things about his piety I don't really like. It is very elitist. It's very much of the mind and not much else. And in fact, in many other ways, he will actually be a precursor. A lot of scholars think of him this way, as a precursor of the Enlightenment. He's sometimes compared to Voltaire, which again, Voltaire is kind of an anti-clerical, but that the comparison is not without its aptness. Erasmus doesn't like what he calls dogmatism. He doesn't like fighting. He likes peace. He criticizes the European leaders for starting wars. He's very much, about, civility and not causing fights. And this is something, for Erasmus, his version of the faith, of the Christian faith, is very, it's almost like he wanted to excise all the sort of darker, archaic elements in the human soul and make it safe. He liked a safe religion that didn't cause too many problems. It's one of the reasons why it's kind of an unrealistic, I think, version of the Christian faith. As opposed to, as we'll get to now, his opponent here, Luther, and his revolution, which it is a revolution against the church, the initiator of the Protestant Reformation. And if I am presenting, Erasmus is a medieval person in many ways. You can also see him as a precursor of a modern type. I think you can kind of see Luther as a precursor of a modern type, even though he's very medieval himself. He had a base of his early life there. He was the son of a miner in a mining family in Erfurt, where he was born in modern-day Germany. And in fact, his father wanted him to be a lawyer so he could help out the family business. They were pretty well off while he was a youth, when he was in their household. He liked to talk about himself as coming from peasant stock when he was much later in his career, which was technically true, but they were well off. Later on, the mining business collapsed, but while he was there, he was very much middle class in modern terms. It's not exact, but they had money for the time. And in fact, one of his more recent biographers thinks it's had an influence, the milieu of the mining family and the mining industry in medieval Europe, because it was so rough and tumble that you had to be very assertive to sort of make your way in this world. I think this rubbed off on Luther, who was nothing if not assertive in many, many ways. And The reason why he doesn't become a lawyer is because he makes a vow. He's a very pious young man, and so he goes off, travels somewhere during a rainstorm, and so the story goes, lightning storm hits, and he's so terrified by the lightning that he makes a vow to Saint Anne that if he survives this lightning storm, then he will go become a monk. And so he survives, and so he goes and becomes a monk. And there's the Augustinian order, the same one that Erasmus entered and left, and not coincidentally. And goes to the monastery there, and is a very scrupulous person. Is Martin Luther. He worried a lot about his salvation. This is something, by the way, that's not typical of a lot of people in late medieval Europe. It's not as if everyone's sort of, obsessed about whether they're going to be saved or not. He admitted to being overly scrupulous later in his life, and someone who sort of wrestled with these sorts of questions. Claimed at one point that the devil visited him in his cell in the monastery. So again, he has this kind of personality. Eventually, his superior, named Johann von Staupitz, decides to send him to the university to get a degree and become a theologian, a teacher there. At the new university, founded in late 15th century at Wittenberg, and he goes and becomes a professor of theology. This will be the turning points in his life. He'll become, once he's ensconced at Wittenberg, again, one of the popular sort of professors there, and he'll begin to study, of course, the scripture itself in that setting. He'll revolt against his scholastic training. I won't go into this too much detail, but it's one of the things he'll sort of plunge him into his combat with the medieval church. A couple of things about just his personality. Whenever I teach Luther's texts in my Western Civ courses, I always get an adverse reaction because he can be, well, he's an angry guy. If you ever wondered why, read his works. He's really, a lot of his works are polemics. That's why, partly. But he was kind of an angry guy. And in fact, he actually, I can't remember the quotation, but this is a paraphrase, but he said at one point that anger was a good thing. It was a good thing to be angry. And I can't tell you what a strange sentiment that is. If you're wondering why he was so angry, according to all of his biographers, he suffered from what he called Anfechtung. And what this seems to have been is a form of severe depression. And I say this because I always wonder, why is he so? Like, you ever read his work, he's really pissed off. What's his problem? Well before the Reformation. And, if you think about this for a second, about Luther, this is the period, of course, before modern medicine. You can't take, antidepressants or anything like this. One way to sort of, get out of your depression is to gin yourself up into anger. And I can kind of imagine someone who, he faces down popes, he faces down kings and emperors and stuff like this. You have to think that, okay, the kind of depressive personality, either you're gonna, if you fold, if you give in, you're gonna collapse mentally. And so the only way you can not give in and collapse mentally is to sort of gin up your anger like this. And it must explain something about the man, I think. That's a very anti-classical way of thinking. Just to give you an example, the ancient Roman philosopher Seneca listed anger as one of the worst vices you could practice. Why? Because anger led to conflict within the community, right? And the community was everything. Even in the Bible, I believe in one of Paul's letters, there's the phrase, "Don't let the sun go down upon your anger. Don't be angry." And so for him to sort of, valorize anger like this is kind of an interesting thing. And a lot of people have psychologized Luther. I don't want to do that too much, but a lot of things do turn on his personality about how things turned out in the Reformation. In any event, by 1516, by 1517, he's become seriously concerned with the problem in late medieval church, which is the abuse of indulgences. If you don't know what indulgences are, this goes back to the idea within Catholicism, very different from Orthodox, but this idea is that Christ gave his authority to specific people, the apostles. They pass it on to other people with the laying of hands. This is apostolic succession. And therefore, that authority gets passed down to do things like forgive sins. And so in the Middle Ages in the West, they developed this idea of purgatory, which again, it has some commonalities, although the way it gets developed in very specific terms is very different and usually not welcomed by the Eastern Orthodox. But it's the idea you need to be purified of your sins before you go into heaven, even if you get saved. This gets into the Divine Comedy of Dante. And so what happens is during the Crusades, an idea of indulgences gets spread. They already had the idea you could pray for the dead in purgatory. What happens is they had this idea that if you go on a pilgrimage, if you go on crusade, you can get time off from your purging of your sins while you're in purgatory. They see it as a place where you spend a lot of time, purging out your sins in this life. In a very sort of monetary way almost. Well, what happens is people, instead of going on crusade, eventually begin to buy their way out. It becomes, over time, this purpose gets lost, and it becomes a way for people to buy their way out of purgatory, not hell, but purgatory. And then eventually, of course, becomes a way for the church to make money. And in particular, it's very bad in the early 16th century in Germany, partly because the papacy owes debts to bankers called the Fuggers in the, I can't remember which German city off the top of my head, but they owe them money. One of the ways they propose to pay them back is they have Dominicans, especially one, Johann Tetzel is the main one, to go and preach indulgences in Germany. And despite the fact that he says some hanky things, he apparently didn't actually say things like, I'll get you out of pay the coin and get your loved ones out of hell for free or something like this. But it did cause concern among people, like not just Luther, but other people as well. So this is what led to him. In fact, he actually wrote, I think, an earlier one that had, I think I want to say 70 theses, but eventually in 1517, he typed up a list, or wrote up a list of 95 theses on indulgences, which we're not really sure, by the way, that he actually posted them on the door of this cathedral or the church in Wittenberg. We're not really sure which one he would have posted on. We're not really sure if he actually did this with the intention of having an actual debate, because sometimes what you would do in medieval universities, you would announce a debate like this and announce the topic beforehand. What seems to have happened is he seemed to have drawn this up to send it to his bishop, the Bishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Mainz, to notify him about what he thought were these abuses. And one of the things that happens is that he sends this letter, which is private, to the Archbishop, and eventually it gets into the hand of printers who print the 95 Theses, and it becomes a wild bestseller. Again, you can imagine I'm calling it Germany, this is the Empire, we'll call it the Empire, but German-speaking people, where they've had this Reform Council 100 years ago, where the papacy, because it's foreign and kind of corrupt, is not very popular. All of a sudden, these criticisms of indulgences, they sell like hotcakes. And it makes them overnight into a celebrity in a way that Luther did not plan at all. It's kind of interesting the way this happens. And we tend to see today, like 1517 is the date of, the Reformation, but there wasn't really his intent. The actual theses themselves, they can be harsh. There's really nothing there that says indulgences themselves are wrong. There really isn't. They're actually they're within the mainstream of orthodoxy, definitely, by 1517. Nonetheless, within a year, he does draw the attention of Rome. And so he is called to a meeting with Cardinal Cajetan. Cardinal Cajetan Thomas Vio is a scholar, a humanist, actually, someone who actually has written on a bunch of things. Anyway, he was a scholar of Thomas Aquinas. And he meets with Cajetan in 1518. They basically demand that he recant what he said. And because at this point, by 1518, things have shifted already. The publicity that Luther has gotten from all this has seemed to have pushed him into a much more radical stance. He refuses to recant. At that point, Cajetan basically refers his case to Rome. This is important to note here, because after he refers his case to Rome, this becomes a legal proceeding, which is to say it's opening up a legal proceeding in which he can be condemned for heresy and then executed. So everything he does from this time onward, Luther does, he's partly has in the back of his mind, I need to get out of this, otherwise I'm going to be put to death. And so it's really from 1518 around this time, he basically gets radicalized. And he writes in 1520 his three great Reformation tracts. This is on the Babylonian captivity of the church, which finally does start attacking the sacramental system of the Catholic Church, medieval church. The freedom of a Christian, which is his work on, again, denying the necessity of good works for salvation. All you need is faith alone. We'll get to that in a moment. That's his main idea. We'll come back to this, and for rejecting the authority of the medieval church, but also his appeal to the German nobility. And the reason why that's an important one is, of course, he's appealing to them because he wants them to reform the church. Again, the back of his mind is, again, if the German nobility aren't on his side, they can seize him and have him put to death. So he wants to get them on his side. And there is definitely a constituency for this in the empire. It's one of the things in the background here is that, well, look at the Diet of Worms in 1521. I should mention 1520, he gets condemned. The Pope actually issues a bull. I'll show you in a moment the bull, actually, which condemns as a heretic. But it doesn't really work. And the reason why, to go back to all this reform clamor, people were waiting for a council to decide this. Because again, even though they haven't worked up to this time, people are still waiting for that because they think that's what's necessary to do all this. This is one of the reasons why Luther kind of isn't actually burned at the stake. Another reason is the Diet of Worms, 1521. He's called a diet's a meeting of the imperial princes. And he's called there by the new emperor, Charles V. He's a very Catholic ruler. Calls him there. He gives him a couple of days to defend himself. He gives him safe conduct. And this is very important. This is where he gives his famous speech. I can do no other. Here I stand. Well, all that stuff. There are parts of it are apocryphal parts of it. Point is, he takes his stand on his reading of Scripture and of Scripture itself, basically against tradition, against the church's authority. Very dramatic. The next day, when they condemn him, Charles V gives his own speech, which you should read if you find it. It's pretty interesting. Whereas he says, look, I'm a Christian prince descended from Christian princes. I can't let the opinion of one monk tear apart the Christian world. It's very fascinating. It's very, divergent, views on this stuff. But he is condemned. However, Charles V, being a man of his word, I kind of like Charles V to a certain degree, lets him go. He doesn't. He could have just seized them right there. Easily have done it. Would have been not a problem. In fact, we know this because as soon as he left, when Luther left Worms, he was kidnapped, not by Charles V, but by Duke Friedrich of Saxony, who was his protector. And he kidnapped him to keep him away from people who were trying to seize him and have him put to death. It's under the protection of the princes of Germany that he does most of his work for the rest of his life. Without their help, he would have been obviously put to death. And it's from 1522 onward, he begins to publish his own translation of the New Testament. He'll publish the Old Testament as well a decade later. Very different from Erasmus, translated into German. Puts his own spin on things, becomes very influential in the development of the German language, actually, of High German. So that's the break with Rome in 1522. And just a couple of things here. This is one of the printed versions. I don't know which one of Martin Luther, the 95 Theses. You can kind of see the numberings here, how many there are. But again, get the sense of what this is and what this means like. It's just a list of grievances, basically, things that he thinks are wrong. The 95 Theses. This, on the other hand, is the bull of Leo X, the Medici Pope, who was not as corrupt as his predecessors, actually better than his predecessors, but he's the one who condemned Luther. I can't remember the actual name of it's given to it. In any event, Exsurge Domini, that's the name of the bull, papal bull, Rise Up, O Lord, which was also printed and Luther had burnt after he got condemned by the Pope. One of the things, we'll get to this in a moment, I mentioned this, I'll mention this going forward. One of the things that transforms this debate from a theological thing that is kind of above theologians to this massive evolution is printing. And one of the things you can see is one of the key reasons why. When this is a print of Luther at Worms and him, I guess presumably reading the Gospels of the Pope and his curial cardinals, whom you must think of probably being depicted as being sort of wealthy and corrupt here, is that from the very beginning, printers, and Luther did this as well, they printed things in German. And they also printed a lot of woodcuts of images like this. They, from the very beginning, appeal to public opinion. They appeal to the populace, those who could read in German, those who couldn't, to make their claims. And by the way, let me say, they weren't really being all that fair about all this. They were trying, again, to be fair to him, he was fighting for his life, but this is a propaganda war of them. The Catholic theologians and the Curia didn't really understand this. I mean, it took them years before they did anything like this. Printed popular work. They printed large Latin tomes trying to answer his arguments. Luther understood this wasn't about arguments. This was about emotion and opinion. And again, he has this in common with the humanists in the sense that he's appealing to emotion, really. He's not really concerned. He's trying to blacken the Pope's name as much as possible, which, to be fair, the late medieval papacy made that kind of easy. But it was a sort of rhetorical warfare on his part. But you can't really overstate that role. Printing and publicity was very important to this. Again, first of all, it really did, as far as I can tell. Luther was not expecting this. He didn't set out to defy the church. The publicity he got, I think, made him think, first of all, A, he was right, and then B, that he could stand up to all these people. And I think that helped transform him over time, give him the confidence to do what he was doing, knowing he had the backing of a nascent movement. I don't know if you put it in those terms, but you have those things transforming his initial, protests to what he thought were errors to, because it is kind of it's still a mysterious thing. Where does he go from being just a medieval reformer? A lot of people had said the same things, to all of a sudden, no, burn it all down. He's not saying that, but he's saying burn most of it down, actually. These are some of the things I think do this. One, of course, is his, I'm putting it in quotation marks, quote unquote, discovery of sola fide. This is the idea that, you are justified by faith alone, which even according to a modern Protestant historian, Alistair McGrath, this is a pretty novel idea. This idea that you are justified by faith alone. There's really not much precedent for it. The idea, there'd always been the assumption that you had to perform some good works in Christian theology before this. He claims to have discovered it in Paul's writings. This is a big difference between him and Erasmus, because Erasmus, we'll get to this in a moment, believes in free will. Luther does not. But it's, as he says, it's to him the doctrine upon which the Reformation turns. And I think for my, about the transformation from reformer to revolutionary, I think he embraces doctrines like this, sola scriptura, for, to me, are obvious reasons. That is to say, he needs to reject the authority of the church because, well, first of all, they're trying to kill him, but also because he's convinced that the only way to get rid of what he thinks are false beliefs is to get rid of these, these authorities. So he adopts beliefs that basically do that. They dissolve that authority. I think it's a means to an end. I really do. Psychologically, I'm not saying he's being dishonest. He's not at all. But I think people, they adopt certain ideas because they give certain things. They make for him, this is his justification for everything he did. One thing that must have happened as well, made this possible, is the inactivity of the bishops in Germany, especially. This has puzzled some people, but it kind of goes back to, again, what we mentioned already, is that the bishops of Germany were kind of waiting on either an imperial, waiting for a council of the church to decide this question, what was going to happen to Luther. That expectation of reform made them antsy, and they didn't want to proceed on the papal authority alone. And so that's why they didn't react more strongly against him. And so they just did nothing, basically. Again, that must have also made Luther think, hey, I must be right. These people want to defend themselves, right? It's very interesting the way things turned out. And then finally, most obviously, this goes back to what I mentioned in the first lecture about the makeup of the Holy Roman Empire, which is this, again, it's not a sovereign government, it's not a sovereign ruler, the emperor. He can't just grab him and take him because Duke Friedrich has certain rights he can't trample on. The princes have enough power to protect him. And in fact, at the Diet of Worms, usually historians talk about the beginning of the so-called magisterial Reformation, when they appeal to magistrates. In other words, it becomes a state-run Reformation in the empire and in Germany. That'll change when it gets into other places in terms of Calvinism, but in most places it'll become a state-run thing because of this. Would never have, he would have burnt the stake, no question, would have died with him, almost certainly. Like many reformers had, like many people who challenged the church's authority had before. But finally, this brings me, I want to bring this back together with Erasmus and talking about early modernity and everything. Because what you have in Erasmus and Luther is a clash of two reformers. They're both reformers. And Erasmus, if you ever heard the phrase, sometimes this gets bandied about. The phrase went that Luther hatched the egg that Erasmus laid. The idea was, and there's some people that blamed him at the time, his criticisms of monasticism, of the corruption of the church, of its devotional life, of its theology, softened the ground for Luther and made it possible. I think that probably has some truth to it, I think. And what's also true about this is that Luther badly wanted Erasmus on his side. Even before he makes his break with Rome in 1516, he pens a public letter to him, asking for his support on his, reform ideas. Erasmus had early praise for him, by the way. Up until 1520, he praised. He believed at one time wrote of him that he was an almighty, a trumpet for the almighty gospel. He had positive things to say about Luther. But the big thing, again, for Erasmus, again, this gets down here to partly ideas, partly personality. Erasmus was a guy who wanted peace. He valued the unity of the church for that reason. He was also afraid that Luther's appealing to Scripture, appealing to the text, would bring condemnation upon what he called, quote unquote, good letters upon humanism. He, in fact, had been condemned. In fact, there were people who did criticize Erasmus, not for what he was doing in terms of his linguistic pursuits of ancient text, but for some of his doctrinal positions. In other words, they didn't have any problem with going ad fontes, but they had problems, some of them, with his doctrinal positions. So he was very worried about that. And I should mention, by the way, there were plenty of humanists on the Reformation side. One of his followers, Philip Melanchthon, humanist his whole life long. Later on, John Calvin, he trained as a humanist. So it's not like it's a divide in that sense. We're talking about Erasmus here. And for his part, Luther himself had suspicions from the early part that he thought that Erasmus was more concerned with human things than with heavenly things. They were both, by the way, right about each other in many regards. But in particular here, Erasmus had a lot of pressure from both sides. He had friends all over Europe. Friends like Albrecht Dürer, the great woodcut artist, became Protestant, who condemned him for not supporting Luther. Ulrich von Hutten, who was a Swiss reformer who would die in battle, actually, criticized him for this. On the other side, Cardinal Aleander was a member of the Papal Curia, been a roommate at one point of Erasmus, condemned him for criticizing the church so heavily. Erasmus was a guy who wanted to put himself above the fray and be tolerant and be civil and all this stuff. But he couldn't hold this up for long. And eventually, one of the things I'm going to mention it here, will get him into this. Probably is the Peasants' War. A big war breaks out in Germany, partly based on Luther's ideas. We'll come to this next time. But eventually, he decides he needs to, in order to clear his own name from opprobrium, to combat Luther directly. And so in 1524, he publishes a work called De Arbitrario Voluntas, on the freedom of the will. So he decides to debate him on a traditional ground. Smart, because where he agrees with the church more than in other ways. And because one of the things, of course, Luther denies with his doctrine of sola fide, you're justified by faith alone, God gives you your faith. You don't do anything. You don't have free will in regards to salvation. Your works mean nothing. And so against this, Erasmus reiterates the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church, which will be reaffirmed later with the Council of Trent, that even though God moves us to do good works and that he brings our salvation to completion, we still have to do good works to contribute to it. And he makes appeals in this work to tradition, to the consensus of the early church fathers, to medieval theologians. And he says, you need this. You need consensus. You need to have it. You can't have unity in the church without this consensus. You can't have someone just declaring on their own authority that this is so. So he's attacking Luther on other grounds than just the doctrine of free will. He wants to get him at this regard as well. And in this work, he reaffirms his belief in the Catholic Church, the need for a visible authority of the church. In other words, you need to know where the authority is to decide these questions, even if it's done by consensus over time. He's not a big defender of papal infallibility or anything like that. Neither really is his friend Thomas More, who mostly they're defending tradition in all this, the need for visible continuity of the past. And in fact, this is the great irony of this. He actually invokes scholastic terminology in his debate with Luther. The great anti-scholastic thinker himself invokes none other than Thomas Aquinas in his work against Luther. I'm sure, by the way, he did this partly to silence his critics on the Catholic side, which didn't work. Eventually, in the 1570s, when it's not created in the 1550s, the Catholic Church of Rome will create an index of prohibited books and actually put some books on there. But he invokes the greatest of the scholastics, Thomas Aquinas, the great Aquinas, against Luther. And so it says, no, you do have freedom of will. And so the great humanist comes down on the opposite side of it. So again, different with Melanchthon, who was also a humanist, different with Calvin, who's definitely a humanist and definitely doesn't believe in free will in regards to salvation. On the other side of this, Luther responds with probably, I think, again, a lot of Luther's works are very overheated. I think this is his best work, actually. Bondage of the Will. Perfect response, right? And the idea is, of course, we don't have any free will. We are basically pawns of the Almighty. All the Protestant reformers have a very, very high sense of the majesty and authority of God. And they think that basically saying that human beings are free in any respect vis-a-vis God is simply anathema. If that's the case, then he's not really free. He's not really all-powerful, if that's the case. And so therefore, human free will is incompatible with the free will of God. There's basically just God's will and nothing else. And he takes this, by the way, to its greatest extreme. One of Erasmus's arguments against Luther is that, look, if you say we have no free will, how can there be something like the existence of hell? How can you be sent to eternal damnation if you can't, by your own will, merit that punishment? And Luther goes all the way and says, mainly because it doesn't matter, because even people who do evil things act under the direct impulse of God. God does evil through them who do evil. That's the exact phrase, at least in the English translation that I've read, of the bondage of the will. He goes no holds barred. And in fact, he adopts, does Luther, a very radical version of what's called theological voluntarism. This is the idea that God is not bound by categories of reason. He can do whatever he wants. This is something that Erasmus would reject, all the scholastics would reject, most of them anyway. Aquinas definitely would reject. God is reason, so he has to act according to it. Nope. Luther's like, he can do whatever he wants. He can change his mind. Nothing he does can be unjust. Very radical. And against Erasmus, he gives, he says, no, all you need is scripture. It is perspicacious to understand these questions about how you're saved and what you need to do. I don't need to do anything, actually. That's the big thing, but he says it's perfectly clear, and you just got it wrong, Erasmus. You just don't know what you're talking about. You're too worldly. You mix classical authors with the Gospels. All that stuff is just false. You're just trying to justify your own falsehoods. And he goes even further by denying that you need a visible church. Says there's basically all they really need is the church of the elect, who've been chosen by God. They don't need a visible church, let you know where to go to work out your salvation. And this can only be known through the Holy Spirit. Something, Erasmus, dings him on. I was like, how do you know how you have the Holy Spirit? Well, one way he kind of suggests you have this is that he says, well, you know what? You're a true Christian if you are assertive. If you're certain about your salvation, then you must be a real true Christian. Real Christians aren't nice and civil and peaceful like you want to be, Erasmus, with your false peace and your false beliefs. No, they have to be, in the fray and basically being as loud and obnoxious as they can, I guess. But this is his response, right? Saying, no, peace isn't more important than truth of the gospel. Putting this away is a bad thing. And we simply have to get rid of it for the sake of what he understands to be the gospel. And in the end, Erasmus will write a couple more responses to this, but this is the end of any sort of rapprochement between Erasmus and Luther. Gives up with the bondage of the will, trying to convince him. And this is what I finally want to wrap this up with in terms of this, the Reformation era, is that, again, this divide is not just between what will become Catholic and Protestant. It's between a reform movement that's already in existence before any of this happens. And that, of course, humanism crossed the theological divide. Humanism is something shared between Protestant, eventually Protestant Catholics. And moreover, that the schism that occurs, and it does occur, Luther eventually, he starts what will be called the Lutheran Church. That wasn't his intention, but it's what happens. They'll get I'll talk about this stuff next time, but the schism occurs between reformers. That's one of the reasons it's so bitter. Not just between Erasmus and Luther, but because of this is a personal thing. People who've known each other in the universities, some who've gone really far in criticizing the church, some won't go that far. And for people who do go that far, it's personal. In fact, I'll talk about this next time when I talk about women in the Reformation. Even that, it happens there. It divides them in that sense. And that some of the things that break the church are personalities. Erasmus versus Luther, his personality. I'll talk a little bit about the English Reformation next time. Definitely the personality of Henry VIII makes a huge difference. The personality of Charles V. If Henry VIII had been in custody of Martin Luther, trust me, he would have killed him. No question about it. Would not have let him go. Charles V, you can thank him for being a nice guy, but the Reformation happened. But also, of course, theological positions. In the end, Erasmus couldn't paper over the differences, which were real. They weren't just a matter of, methodological differences like they were with the humanists and scholastics. They weren't just about corruption. They were about serious issues. And then finally, the last thing to note about all this is that, and I didn't get this too much with Luther, that he's also against a lot of the things that Erasmus is that reform in this period, Catholic and Protestant, is kind of aimed at popular traditions. It's the reform of the bookish elite against some of the more, and again, some of the popular traditions of the Middle Ages are kind of, I can see why. But in other places, and we'll get to this next time, maybe, I'll talk about this when I talk about the English Reformation. They attack, traditions that are otherwise, kind of, we'll talk about this next time, kind of, I don't really see the harm in them looking back at it. But it's kind of an elitist thing from both ends of the court. And eventually those reformers will win out in the Catholic Church. As we'll see, it takes a long time to the Council of Trent. But in any case, that's the lecture on Luther and Erasmus. I hope it was helpful to you guys. The next lecture on women in the era of Reformation will be up in a couple of days. And so I get the second half of this. I'll talk about the Reformation more and also give you some interesting takes on the social implications for women as a result of the Reformation. So thank you guys, and I'll see you.